So I've been doing photography for a little over a year now, and within that year I was able to go from Wisconsin to California and do photography in a studio environment full time. I do a lot of freelance work, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about 3 things that helped me to become a better photographer within that 1 year span. And these 3 things can definitely help anyone who's getting into studio photography. So if that's something that you guys are getting into, or if that's something that you're interested in, make sure you stick around for the entire video so you guys don't miss out on any of these 3 tips to help me improve my work within this last year. Before we start this video, as always, make sure you go ahead and like and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. I appreciate every single one of you that does. We just hit 8,000 subscribers, which is huge. Thank you guys for 8K. While you guys are at it, go ahead and leave a comment in the comment section below to help the algorithm push this video to new viewers. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the first tip that will help you become a better studio portrait photographer. If you guys want to skip to a certain tip, I'll have them in the timeline as well as linked in the description below so you guys can skip to a specific tip. Let's go ahead and start with tip number 1, which is be consistent. This is the number 1 thing that I need to tell you guys. If you are trying to become a photographer, it doesn't even matter if it's a studio photographer, but any photographer in general, you need to become as consistent as possible, because the more work you put out and the more you shoot, the better you're going to be at your craft. Photography, just like any other craft, requires you to do a lot of repetitions so you guys can begin to master photography, so you guys can get a feel of the photography setting, and so you guys can just get more comfortable behind the camera and in a studio environment with lights and with backdrops and with all this other stuff. You need to be doing this on a regular basis so you guys can become more efficient when it does come time to actually do a client shoot or to do any kind of shoot in general. You want to be able to just, without even having to think about it, without even having to calculate anything, make decisions on the fly. And you're not going to get that if you're only shooting once a month, once every other month, you know, very rarely. If you really want to become a photographer, you need to make sure that you're putting in consistency, because consistency is going to help you way more than anything else. It's one of the things that skyrocketed my growth as a photographer, and one of the things that allowed me to get to the point that I am as fast as I did. Consistency is going to help you with 3 areas. The first area is it's going to help you build up your portfolio. If you're a new photographer, chances are you probably don't have a lot of work underneath your name, which means it's going to make it harder for you to get clients. It's going to make it harder for you to get collaborations. It's going to make it harder for you to showcase what you're capable of doing. And being consistent and just shooting more is going to help all 3 of those areas, because it's going to actually show people what you're capable of doing. The second thing it's going to help is to actually master your craft. Obviously, like I mentioned, the more times you do something, the better you're going to get at it. So if you want to get better at photography, the easiest and the most simple way of doing it is just shoot more photos. It's going to make you a lot better behind the camera. It's going to make you a lot better in a studio environment. It's going to make you just understand things a lot better, because you're going to be doing it so much that things are going to be a lot easier for you in terms of switching your camera settings, in terms of switching your lighting, and in terms of switching your compositions and all that kind of stuff. The more repetitions you put in, the better you're going to be at it. And obviously, if you want to get paid client work, you want to be as good at your craft as possible, and doing photo shoots consistently is going to help with that. And the third thing that it's going to help you with is to get into a creative groove. Obviously, if you're doing a lot of photo work in a studio environment like the studio I have behind, which is just a white backdrop, you need to kind of have some kind of creativity, because as you guys can see, it's just a white backdrop. There's not really that much there. So it's up to you as a photographer to create the creative aspect of it. Otherwise, you're just gonna have generic white backdrop photos, which if that's what you want to do, go for it. But it's always good to just kind of have your own creative twist to it. So putting in a lot of work is going to allow you to kind of demonstrate what you're capable of doing with something as simple as a white backdrop. And it's going to let you get into a creative groove, and it's going to allow you to see the backdrop as a blank canvas instead of just a backdrop. And this is going to help you with getting better work. It's going to help you with creating cooler things. And it's going to ultimately just make you a lot more creative of a photographer at the end of the day, which is going to help you in all the aspects that I've talked about thus far. So my number 1 tip to people that are trying to get into photography is be as consistent as possible. I know that it's a little bit harder at first, but the more consistency you can put into it, the more you're gonna grow. When I first started shooting photography a little over a year ago, I was shooting every single day, and it made me such a better photographer, because the more I was able to shoot, the better I got with understanding my camera and understanding how lighting worked and understanding photography in general. And I was able to apply everything that I learned in real time and kind of tweak it as I went, because I was putting in all those repetitions and doing all those photo shoots. That is tip number 1, is be consistent and you will become a better photographer. Tip number 2 is, this is something that I see a lot of people struggle with, but it's making excuses. Stop making excuses for yourself. When you're a photographer, The easiest thing to do is to say that you can't get a specific look because you don't have specific gear. And let me tell you, 99.9% of the time, that's complete BS. You can get a lot done with photography with very minimal gear, and I proved that with my photography. When I first started photography, I didn't have any expensive equipment, I didn't have an expensive camera, I didn't have any expensive backdrops, I didn't have access to studios, I didn't have access to models, I didn't have any of that, and I was still able to build up my portfolio in my room in the middle of Wisconsin in a small farm town of 20,000 people, and that allowed me to eventually make this my full-time job. So stop making excuses for yourself and stop telling yourself that you don't have the equipment because you don't need it. Stop telling yourself you don't have an expensive camera because, again, you don't need it. Stop telling yourself you don't have access to a studio so you can't make studio style photos because that's not true. Yes, you can. And stop telling yourself you don't have access to models because you don't need a professional model to take good photos. If you're a good photographer and you're trying to be a good photographer, it's your job to be able to make any person that steps in front of your camera look like they're a professional model, because as a photographer, you need to be able to guide someone who doesn't necessarily know how to pose, because at the end of the day, there are going to be clients that aren't models. There are going to be clients that have never modeled in their life. And if you're a good photographer, you'll still be able to make them look like a professional model behind the camera. When I first began photography, the lights that I used were just cheap $50 lights on Amazon you guys can get, and they come with stands, they come with barn doors, and they're literally everything you need to get started. They're not the best lights, but with these lights, I was able to build my portfolio, and I was able to land a lot of paid gigs using just these lights. I didn't have a backdrop. I simply just bought some paper from a fabric store and used that as a backdrop, and I clipped these backdrops onto like tripod stands that I thrifted for $5 at a local thrift store, and I made it work. So stop telling yourself that you need a studio, because you don't. And when it comes to camera gear, you again do not need expensive gear to make great photos. The camera that I was using when I first started was the Sony a6000, which got stolen, so I upgraded to a Sony a6400, which is just like very minor upgrade. It's like the newer version of it, but you can get these cameras used for like as little as $500, and with the a6000 you can probably find that for like $300. Slap a Sigma 1.4 30mm lens on it, which is like $200, and you're gonna get a really good system to get you going and allow you to dip your toes into the world of photography without spending a ton of money up front. If you guys want to know the best gear that I recommend for someone that's on a tight budget, let me know in the comment sections, and I'll go ahead and make a video describing everything that I used when I was on a budget, because when I first started, I didn't have any money to go and spend on a bunch of lights. Obviously now I do, because I do this for full time and companies like to send me stuff, but when I first started, I didn't have any of that, but I did not let that stop me, because like I said, tip number 2 is don't make excuses for yourself, because that's only going to limit you, and that's only going to stop you from fulfilling your goal of becoming a full-time photographer or just becoming a better photographer in general. Stop letting excuses get to you and just go out and make the photos that you want with whatever gear you have, because I promise you it's probably not that hard to do. You just got to think outside of the box. And the last tip that I have for you guys that are trying to become better photographers, and more specifically portrait studio photographers, is experiment. You want to make sure you're experimenting as much as possible, because like I mentioned earlier, you're typically going to be working with nothing but a white backdrop, and white backdrops are, in my opinion, pretty versatile. You can get a lot done with something as simple as a white backdrop, but this also applies to people that don't necessarily want to be studio photographers. If you just want to be a photographer in general, one thing I recommend to people is experiment as much as possible. The more you experiment, the more you'll get a taste of what you actually like and what you don't like. If you're just getting into photography and you don't necessarily want to be a studio photographer, like in an environment like this, you want to do like portrait work outside or something like that, try that. Go and do as many different types of photography as possible. There's landscape photography, there's street photography, there's outdoor portrait photography, there's studio portrait photography, there's car photography, there's product photography, there's fashion photography. There's tons of different types of photography, and if you're just getting started, make sure you try all of them so you can see which ones you naturally gravitate towards more, because if you try and force portrait photography but you don't actually like it, it's going to be hard for you to become great at it, because you don't want to become great at something you don't necessarily love. If you love cars and you really like the whole car aesthetic and the car culture, car photography is probably the best bet for you. If you like animals, if you like landscapes, if you like mountains, if you like being outdoorsy, landscapes are probably the best bet for you. But you could love animals and love mountains and love cool scenery and love all of that, and then end up hating landscape photography because your heart is in portrait photography. Or you can love studios and being in a studio environment and stuff, and then end up being the best version of yourself when you do landscape photography. It really kind of goes both ways. You won't really know until you go out and experiment. But don't stop experimenting on just the type type of photography that you do, keep experimenting even when you do settle on a photography. Try different focal lengths, try different lighting setups, try different cameras, try different everything. Do as much as you can to experiment with your photography so that you can get a taste of what you truly like. And again, this is going to kind of backtrack to tips number 1 and 2. The only way you're going to do this is if you stay consistent and you don't give yourself excuses. Do those 2 things and try experimenting, and you will become a better photographer. That about does it for this video. If you guys have any questions in the comment section below, let me know. The reason I made this video is because I always get questions in my DMs and in my messages and emails about how I became such a good photographer in the short amount of time that I did, and I just simply followed these 3 things. Obviously I could get more in depth with them, but you don't really need to. These are just 3 things that you can definitely start applying to yourself today and become a better photographer. If you guys aren't following me on social media, go ahead and follow me at Moody Darkroom. That's on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, everything you can think of, I'm on there at Moody Darkroom. And if you guys aren't subscribed, make sure to subscribe so you guys don't miss out on any future content, as well as hit that like button and leave a comment in the comment section to push this video to new viewers. I hope you guys learned something in this video, and I hope you guys can apply these tips to your photography to take you to the next level. But with that being said, I will see you guys in the next one. See ya.